This is Party 93.4, your commercial-free station.
In the United States, there's 2.4 million people who are in prison alone, just in the prisons. There's over 800,000 a year who are being released from prison all over this country, and most of them, 2/3 of them, reoffend. Something happens along the way upon their release that they end up within 18 months to 3 years reoffending, back in jail, and many of them back in prison. In fact, the research says that the majority of folks who are going to get out of prison between the ages of 19 and 32 are going to return to prison. The research says that you, being 21, are in the highest risk group of returning to prison. In fact, the research is so clear that bed space is being made and was being made prior to your release for your return. Not for your continued success out here, but for your return. And so projections on the amount of bed space needed in order for us to deal with a massive prison population is based on what we know we're seeing happen around the country with individuals within a certain age range, even within a certain ethnic group. So it goes even beyond your age to your ethnicity. We know from the research that African American males are going to be incarcerated at a disproportionate rate to anyone else in society. The numbers are clear. So the question becomes, how do we frame this issue in a way that allows us to have power over the outcome? How do we begin to really understand that it's not enough to talk about how injustice leads to mass incarceration? Because the larger issue of social injustice is a systemic issue. It's an issue that we may or may not be able to change in our lifetime. So you've got to find a way that you are empowered to make changes at the level that you can act every day consistently in order for you to then take the elephant down bite by bite rather than trying to simply kill it at one time. That's what becomes important in our dialogue. So the theme of this work has to do with, how did you get there in the first place? Because if you never know what it is that led to your initial incarceration, it will be very difficult for you to figure out how to stay out once released. You don't know how you got there. Some of us are so confused that we think that we're in prison simply because the system is racist and unjust. And then there are others who think, I'm just in prison because I had an alcohol problem or a drug problem. Then there's others who would tell you, I'm only in prison because I was poor and my daddy was selling drugs, my mother sold drugs, and my granddaddy sold drugs. They'll actually give you a family history that for them explains why they're in prison and why they keep going back, even though you're part of their family. I mean, even though it's your brother who you grew up with, and you know you told him, stop stealing people's stuff. He took your stuff. He was in your purse. And you said to him, what is wrong? You couldn't find a way to reach him where he was, so the problem grew. And as the problem grows, it becomes more uncontrollable, to the point that he now finds himself, or she finds herself, in situations where they're surrounded by people who think just like them, who share the very values that they share. And if that happens, when that happens, then you really have a challenge on your hands as to how to begin to change the dynamic of their incarceration. Because they don't even see that they have power over whether or not they go to jail in the first place. They think that the reason is external to their choices. They convince themselves that the reason for them being in jail, in prison, is because someone else has done something to them, and they have actually begun the process of describing themselves as the victim. And here's the problem with being the victim. You have no power. The underside of being a victim is that something happened to you out of your control. And if it's out of your control, you're not responsible for what happened. We cannot allow that kind of thinking to persist. We cannot allow ourselves, no matter how factual the statement of injustice, no matter how real the experience of racism or any other dynamics that would oppress people and have people in situations where they feel powerless, we cannot allow ourselves not to be challenged by this discussion, at least that suggests we have some power over it, some power greater than that thing which becomes the object or the focus of why we're there, that keeps us from being clear about how we can change it. And so this discussion about to get out and stay out is vitally important, particularly in communities of colors that are disproportionately impacted by incarceration. That leads us to, how is it that a person lands in prison, 19 years old, 18 years old, with so much promise, smart, articulate, well-liked, charismatic. I mean, everything going for him on the surface. You see him and you want him to, if your brother, your son, your cousin, your nephew, you see them and think the best of them, but when they see themselves, they see somebody who's powerless. You see them as powerful, but they see themselves as powerless. You're trying to raise them to be a strong young man or a strong young lady, and at the same time, they're sabotaging their lives at every turn. And you sit back wondering, asking yourself, what is it that I could do differently? It's like when I was sitting in prison and my mother came to visit me for the first time in maximum security prison. She had waited several months to come visit me because, and I didn't understand. I'm like, why didn't you visit me? So she came, she said, I just needed to take some time to figure out, what did I do? What happened that made you end up like this? What have I done? She said, I went back through my whole life to a year before you were born and tried to figure out, what is it that I did wrong that led to you coming out to be in this place when everything I wanted for you in your life was the opposite of this? And I sat there, and she said this with tears, because she had really been doing soul searching about how I got there. The mother who loves you unconditionally, the one who hopes for you something that you can't even imagine for yourself, the one that you would think no matter what is going to be there, and in fact is there, but at the same time is struggling with how you got to where you are when she had hoped something different for you and had committed her life to something different for you. So I sit in the prison visiting room with a discussion that I had never had with my mother. She's asking what she had done. And I said, Mom, wait a minute. It's not what you did, it's what I chose to do. You gave me everything you had to give, but I made some choices that were different than what you intended and expected. And for that, I've got to own it, because you can't change or undo what I've done. That's mine to deal with. That is a very hard place to come to when we're struggling with how we got there. Because the tendency, anytime something bad happens to us, the tendency is to point the finger somewhere else as to why it's happened. We generally don't, at the first turn of things, look at ourselves. We tend to think that there's got to be an external reason. There's got to be someone else or something else that led to this. I'm not a bad person, so this can't be about me. It's got to be about it or them. And if you don't challenge that thinking, then the person will never stay out, no matter how many times they get out.
What did you say your name was?
Dr. Scott Washington and Stevie Styles.
Party 93.4. And now,